If you're a coaster enthusiast, you might know me for my YouTube poops. As much as I enjoy those projects, I am a pretty big fan of those I make fun of, and it was a recent Canobie Coaster review that gave me the idea for this video. He was discussing Comet at The Great Escape, whose relocation I've always considered one of the greatest coaster success stories. We don't think too much of relocated steel coasters, since the pieces usually fit together more easily. Just look at all the Zyklon and Wild Mouse coasters at various carnivals. Remember the Six Flags ride rotation program? Nothing but steel coasters and a few flat rides. Meanwhile, just gaze into the dense structure of a wooden coaster and imagine how much care it takes to move the whole thing. It all needs to be organized and labeled, or else it's just firewood. This is why relocated wooden coasters have such a special place in the coaster community. No matter what kind of ride they give today, you're still grateful to experience them. But how rare are they? Well, out of the 113 Woodies in this country, 10 used to operate at other parks, and today I will be ranking them. While I've only ridden 6 of them, I think I've heard enough about the others to know where they'd rank. Also, a quick honorable mention for 2 Indonesian Wild Mouse coasters, which are made of wood and used to operate in Australia. Leave a comment below if you've ridden one of those. Now that we've got that out of the way, let's move on to the American Woodies. Number 10, Little Dipper at Six Flags Great America. This PTC Junior coaster spent 60 seasons at the now-defunct Kiddieland, about 40 miles away from Great America. While Kiddieland became a fairly common name for children's amusement parks, this was its earliest usage. During the Great Depression, Arthur E. Fritz originally offered pony rides on the site, while several amusements like the Ferris wheel were added in 1940. A decade later, the park saw 2 significant additions. One was the colorful entrance sign, which can still be found at the local library. I wonder how many kids go in there expecting cotton candy and bumper cars. Anyway, there was also the Little Dipper, whose short figure-8 layout with small drops prepared the young guests for larger Illinois coasters. Unfortunately, disputes between park management and landowners led to Kiddieland's closure in 2009, and the Little Dipper was soon auctioned off to Six Flags Great America. Costing $38,000, it was quite a steal, since they could have spent as much as $300,000. Nowadays, the Little Dipper provides a nice contrast to the park's more modern coasters, like the nearby Batman the Ride. Budding enthusiasts can start with this small Woody, and unlike their parents who grew up with Kiddieland, they don't need to leave the park for something more intense. Number 9, Meteor at Little America. In many ways, this is identical to the Little Dipper. You still have those classic PTC trains, and the layout is a mirror image, although Meteor somehow has 200 extra feet of track. Like the Little Dipper, this one also used to run at a children's park near Chicago. In 1953, it opened with Kiddie-Town as the Little Dipper, operating until the park closed about a decade later. Meanwhile, nearby Hillcrest Park was a private picnic area with a few rides, but something was missing. The owners took Kiddie-Town's coaster off their hands for $6,000, although the move cost 11 times as much. Starting in 1967, the Little Dipper provided light thrills for various corporate and private events, and since enthusiasts could not simply show up uninvited, this was quite a rare credit. However, over the years, fewer and fewer corporate events were held, and by 2003, the owners decided they were better off selling the property. When the rides were auctioned off that same year, Little America paid $9,000 for the Little Dipper, although it wasn't until summer 2007 when it was up and running at the Wisconsin park, making it the only coaster on this list to be moved twice. Now known by the much cooler name Meteor, it fits perfectly with the other vintage coasters nearby. Yes, even that one. But the question is, why rank Meteor higher than the previous entry? That's easy. Little America gives you 3 laps on this thing. Also, it does look like it runs faster. Number 8, Arkansas Twister at Magic Springs. Easily one of our country's most obscure Woodies, it doesn't have the best reputation among enthusiasts who make it out there. Despite its gorgeous setting in the woods, the out and back layout is supposed to be nearly devoid of airtime, and one hill on the return trip is notoriously dull. Not to mention, Magic Springs must have been trolling the enthusiasts when they put Twister in the name. But despite its flaws, it does have an interesting history. Designed by Don Rosser, who gave us half a dozen Woodies in the 70s, it was originally built in 1978 for Circus World in Central Florida. As the winter headquarters of Ringling Brothers and Barnum and Bailey, it started with a large tent-like building featuring various attractions, while the park was to expand outward from there. Part of the expansion was the Roaring Tiger, a beautiful wooden coaster that was briefly named for its biggest fan, Michael Jackson. Maybe the ride was more of a thriller back then, but now it's just bad. Anyway, Circus World tanked in the mid-80s, but for a few more seasons, the coaster lived on as the Florida Hurricane at the new Boardwalk and Baseball. While the park's classic American theme was praised, it was the poor execution that kept it from lasting through the 90s. Fortunately, all of the major coasters were put up for sale, and a small Arkansas park snatched up the Florida Hurricane for just $10 grand. By the time it opened at Magic Springs, not even $1 million was spent, so I like to call this the Walmart Woody. Almost 30 years later, the Arkansas Twister may not offer a top-tier ride experience, but I'd say the state is pretty lucky to have it, especially with the King of Pop's endorsement. Number 7, Wildcat at Frontier City. One of the few remaining coasters by National Amusement Devices, the Wildcat was originally designed for a park near modern-day Worlds of Fun. This was Fairyland, a traditional family-owned park opening in 1923. While it wasn't much of a coaster hub, it was known for its concerts that often featured black performers, who would not have been admitted as regular guests back then. In later years, the park even booked more prominent acts like Charlie Daniels and Blue Oyster Cult. For thrill seekers, there was a John Miller wooden coaster for a few decades, but because of storm damage in 1966, the park immediately called on NAD for a replacement. The Wildcat opened the following season, serving as the park's signature ride for the next decade. Unfortunately, white attendance declined after the Civil Rights Movement, and starting in 1974, Worlds of Fun was a more modern alternative. The final nail in the coffin was another storm in 1977, which left the park standing but not operating for over a decade, and no coaster on this list stood dormant for as long as the Wildcat. Surprisingly, those at Frontier City were willing to spruce it up for Oklahoma coaster fans, even though it had to be modified to fit the terrain. One of the camelbacks became a double-up, while the lower turnaround would result in some laterals. The new Wildcat opened in 1991 and became quite popular, although additional modifications led to the tamer ride you can experience today. Without the double dip finale and steeper drops, there's only supposed to be weak airtime. Some might say it needs the RMC treatment, but if you ask me, there are other Wildcats that need it more. Number 6, Thunderbolt at Six Flags New England, formerly Riverside Park. From here on out, I'm happy to say these are all coasters I've ridden. Anyway, Thunderbolt might be the biggest surprise on this list. In more recent years, this park has received clones from Six Flags Magic Mountain and Kentucky Kingdom, yet their oldest coaster wasn't even built for them. It was partially designed by Harry Traver, making it the only remaining coaster associated with him, while the other designer, Harry Baker, was best known for his involvement with the Coney Island Cyclone. Speaking of cyclones, that was this ride's original name when it appeared at the 1939 New York World's Fair. In Flushing Meadows, it operated with amusements like the parachute jump, which was moved to Coney Island where it still stands. Meanwhile, Riverside Park had been lacking a coaster for several years, so they tasked Joseph Dramber with rebuilding the Cyclone in Massachusetts. Its name was changed to Thunderbolt after the first year, while the old name would be reused decades later for a more intense Woody. Despite more innovative additions in the Six Flags years, the Thunderbolt remains an attractive centerpiece of the park with its white paint scheme and old-fashioned entrance. The basic layout and smooth ride make it a fine intermediate coaster, but unlike Wildcat, Thunderbolt still has its double dip and original restraints. Unlike Goliath, you can bet it won't be going anywhere. Number 5, Yankee Cannonball at Canobie Lake. While this PTC classic runs considerably better than the nearby Eurofighter, the GCI retracking apparently cost the ride some of its airtime. When I visited Canobie in 2020, I knew it had a good reputation, but after my one ride, I was not impressed enough to wait in line again. Because of how they load the trains, I wasn't able to get the front or back row, so I'm sure I can get a better ride when I go back. Anyway, what GCI did is nothing compared to what happened 85 years ago. In 1896, the Pearsall family opened a trolley park in Waterbury, Connecticut called Lakewood, which would feature live entertainment, boating, miniature golf, and a carousel whose building still stands. Herbert Schmeck designed the park's only roller coaster, which opened in 1930 and operated for 6 seasons. Although there is only one picture of it, it's enough to show just how different it was back then. The layout was straight, and it was able to take quick steps up and down the terrain. Common sense tells us that you can't move a terrain coaster, but during Lakewood's decline, a New Hampshire park was so desperate for a new coaster that they rose to the challenge. Because of Canobie Lake's flatter terrain and space limitations, the layout was turned into an L shape with more traditional hills, and each track segment had to be shortened by 6 inches. Originally dubbed the Greyhound, a once common name that really needs to make a comeback, it has been the park's signature ride ever since, even after a hurricane knocked over the lift hill. To commemorate the Civil War, the park renamed it Yankee Cannonball in 1983, making it one of our country's most patriotic coasters. Just look at those trains today. Not to mention, the ride's interaction with the parking lot is perfect. No wonder guests are so eager to ride. While I do wonder what it was like before 2016, my one ride certainly gave me a warm feeling that made the trip worthwhile. Number 4, Skyliner at Lakemont Park. In my opinion, this is kind of a hidden gem. I guess when the oldest coaster is in the same park, something like Skyliner can seem like an afterthought. At first glance, it's kind of an eyesore with its fading white paint. But on the other hand, what other coaster has both a baseball stadium and the Golden Arches next to it? While the layout is nothing more than drops and elevated turns, this is another case of saved by the buzz bar. In the back, your butt will leave the seat on the larger drops, and it will come back down quite hard if you don't brace for it. Watch those turns as well, because I do recall some laterals. Anyway, we all admire Leap the Dips for its longevity at Lakemont, but that doesn't make the relocation of Skyliner any less impressive. Roseland Park in the Finger Lakes region opened in 1925 as one of the first amusement parks designed to be reached by car. It quickly became known for its dance hall, but rides followed as the park prospered. After the demise of its B.A. Schiff Wild Mouse, an early John Allen creation appeared in 1960, serving as the park's only major coaster for over 25 seasons. I remember someone on Facebook telling me he rode Skyliner at Roseland and that it's no good anymore. I responded with, "Okay, boomer." Anyway, Roseland's popularity waned in the 80s, and the owners decided they were better off selling the property since the lakeside setting made it quite valuable. 2 attractions were auctioned off: the Carousel, which operates at a mall in Syracuse, and the Skyliner. At the time, Lakemont Park was briefly owned by the nearby Boyer Candy Company, and this coaster was one of its investments. While that era is long gone, the Skyliner played an important role in the park when Leap the Dips stood dormant until 1999. Nowadays, it's not much of an amusement park, but with these historic coasters still running, you can have a great afternoon in Altoona. Just pick up some Mallow cups while you're at it. Number 3, Comet at the Great Escape. Without this Woody, odds are I still wouldn't have visited this park by now. I have family in upstate New York, and when I became interested in coasters as a kid, they sometimes mentioned the Comet. In my mind, its legendary status continued, especially once I saw a theme park review video where Rob said there was airtime on every hill. While I did expect more of it in 2018, I found riding it to be kind of a spiritual experience, considering this coaster's history. Easily the most famous defunct Canadian park, Crystal Beach started in 1888 as a sort of religious camp on Lake Erie, and its popularity drew the interest of investors. In the next few decades, additions would include a ferry service to Buffalo, a dance hall, a hotel, and various amusements. Over the course of a century, 12 coasters operated at Crystal Beach, and you could argue that not one but two of them live on. In 1926 and 27, Harry Traver built what were known as his terrifying triplets, which were large twister coasters that were some of the most intense ever built. Out of these three, the Crystal Beach Cyclone was the best known, having lasted for 20 years as the world's safest crash test dummy simulation. However, such a violent ride meant high maintenance costs, so the park gave up on the coaster in 1946. Incidentally, they needed a new one to increase attendance, so they saved on construction costs by reusing the Cyclone's steel structure. Herbert Schmeck created a more graceful double out-and-back design, and the Comet opened on the shore in 1948, where it was Canada's tallest coaster for about 30 years. Unfortunately, the 1980s saw Crystal Beach losing business to newer parks in the region, and despite further investments, 1989 was its last season. The Ferris wheel was sold to a small park in Toronto, while Charles Wood bought the Comet for his park in the Adirondacks. While he didn't have it up and running until 1994, enthusiasts agreed it was worth the wait, and for its first 10 seasons, the Mitch Hawker poll ranked it as one of the top 10 best wooden coasters. More recently, the Comet has been running slower, so the airtime is on the weaker side. On the other hand, the smoothness makes it a great coaster to marathon, especially since the park's other ones are nothing to shout at. Now, if the Great Escape would just give us an RMC Crystal Beach Cyclone, it would bring this epic saga to a close. Number 2, WildOne at Six Flags America. This Maryland park is known for having one of the worst wooden coasters, but at least it compensates with something really interesting. While the WildOne is the world's 4th oldest coaster, there should always be an asterisk with that statement, because it has been through a lot. In 1905, Paragon Park opened on the Massachusetts Bay, where it was marketed as a miniature World's Fair, and even drew comparisons with the Coney Island parks of the time. George Dodge soon became the mastermind behind the project, constantly adding fresh new attractions despite 2 major fires in the 1910s. In lieu of the coaster that burned, John Miller devised a double out-and-back side friction coaster called the Giant Coaster. The name was apt because it opened in 1917 as the world's tallest, holding the record for 8 years. After another fire in 1932, the coaster saw its first modifications, where Herbert Schmeck redesigned it and the trains were given upstop wheels. After yet another fire in 1963, John Allen simplified the Giant Coaster's layout so that the park could afford to keep it open. This was how guests experienced it until Paragon Park closed in 1984. Since condominiums would replace the park, the remains had to be auctioned off, and thankfully someone was interested in the Giant Coaster. Enter Mark Mason, the manager of a Maryland park called Wild World, which had been lacking a coaster. Mason paid $28,000, but that doesn't tell the whole story. Much of the Giant Coaster's structure could not be reused, so the money really went towards the blueprints, trains, and machinery. The ride was relocated and rebuilt by the Dinn Corporation, and the original helix was reincorporated into the layout. Opening in 1986 as the WildOne, I'd say it was one hell of a first coaster for that park. However, the buzz bars are long gone, and several parts of the layout were reprofiled in the years ahead, especially after the park became Six Flags America. I'm sure I missed out on some crazy airtime and laterals, but I didn't know that during my 2018 rides, so I remember the WildOne fondly. There's a nice variety of sensations throughout the train, while the Helix still has some of my favorite laterals on any coaster. For a park with such a bad reputation, WildOne makes the trip worth it before you even ride the Hypercoaster. And the number 1 relocated wooden coaster should come as no surprise. It is Phoenix at Knoebels, the Herbert Schmeck masterpiece that inspired the relocation of other coasters on this list. What can I say about it? Back when I was 9, this was my introduction to airtime, and I knew it was special since someone else on the train wet their pants. Now, despite what the Golden Ticket Awards say, Phoenix is not the best wooden coaster. At least from what I recall in 2017, it relies a bit too much on the airtime towards the end. But with those buzz bars, it's still a damn good time all the way through. This is currently my 11th favorite coaster out of the 260 I've ridden, and we are so lucky the Cannonball family took their little gamble nearly 40 years ago. During World War II, the Johnson family opened the generically named Playland Park in San Antonio, where it was family-owned throughout its existence. Its only coaster would be the Rocket, which opened in 1947 and remained the only major coaster in town. One interesting fact is that sheep were kept under it so that the grass didn't have to be cut. Anyway, this coaster wasn't nearly as well known back then, but by the looks of it, the locals loved it, along with the rest of the park. Therefore, I'm surprised I can't figure out the reason Playland closed, but that's what happened after the 1980 season. Fortunately, the Rocket stuck around in time for a certain Pennsylvanian family to check it out, and by 1984, it was all set for the trip to Cannonballs. However, there were no blueprints to use, so every piece had to be accounted for, while the reconstruction required the expertise of Charles Dinn, known for his work on the Beast at Kings Island. The original trains did not survive, but PTC really did us a favor by rebuilding them. Today, we have perhaps the finest coaster $1.5 million can buy, and the rigorous maintenance on the part of Cannonballs means you can forget about roughness. The influence of the Phoenix, coupled with its world-class ride experience, makes it impossible for me to rank it anywhere but number 1. And that is a wrap for my first real coaster video. I had a lot of fun with it, and I'd be happy to do it again. Whether you like the sound of that, or you'd rather just see more YouTube poops, let me know in the comments below. For now, this is Julian Dale, and I don't corkscrew around.